Hi, everybody, and welcome to my talk, more on recycling roots, data from Gorwaa on a prolific creative word formation process. So, around a year and a half ago, I gave a talk at the Cushitic conference in Naples titled Recycling Roots in Southern Cushitic, an account of a prolific creative process. Now, in it, I drew attention to the fact that the words of the Southern Cushitic languages contain large numbers of words formed from existing roots, which set its lexicon apart from many of their more distant sister languages from the larger Cushitic family. I began by providing the basic mechanism on which words may be formed from existing roots, and then I gave several examples. So I finished by posing some questions about timing and historical scenarios, which led to the patterns we see in the Southern Cushitic languages today. You'll note that I like to call this process prolific and creative, and actually it's this that I'd like to kind of focus in on for today's talk. Specifically, I'll compare Gorwaa and wider Cushitic to show that most root recycling innovations are occurring at least as low as Southern Cushitic, identifying this clade as the locus of this particular creativity. I'll also compare words which are thought to be highly stable cross-linguistically with Gorwaa forms to see how commonly these forms, which would be considered resistant to this kind of change, are innovated through root recycling processes. So there are a couple steps to get us to that point, however. So let's start with why I think this innovative process is so interesting. One of the reasons is that Gorwaa does not exist in a vacuum. So together with the neighboring languages, all highlighted in red on this map, Iraq, Alagwa, and Burunge, Gorwaa is a member of the Southern Cushitic clade within the larger family of Cushitic languages. This is a widely spread family with members located all across the Horn of Africa and Eastern Africa more widely. I don't have any Northern Cushitic languages for this sample, but I do make use of data from the Central Cushitic Agao languages, Bilin, Khamtanga, Kemant, and Aungi, as well as languages from the Eastern clade, including Burji from Highland East Cushitic, as well as the Omotana languages, Rendile and Dasanak, and the lowland Eastern East clade. Our sample is completed then by the Oromoid language Orma. When comparing the languages of the Cushitic family, we not uncommonly encountered patterns where wider Cushitic will pattern one way and Southern Cushitic will pattern in another way. So here we can see that across Cushitic, the word for tooth is rather consistent, all cognate with a form that looks something like ilk. Whereas the Southern Cushitic languages show a different pattern, with most of the words looking something like sehino. This is because the words for tooth in these Southern Cushitic languages have been formed from a different Cushitic root, in this case, one that means something like to stand. So while teeth in most other Cushitic languages are all related to an old root meaning tooth, teeth in most of the Southern Cushitic languages are standing things. They're little things that are standing up in your mouth. Essentially, then, this process strikes me as interesting because it tells us something about one way in which the Southern Cushitic languages came to be the way they are. Certainly things like borrowing from other languages, as well as slow processes of regular change, have also contributed to these languages differentiating from the other Cushitic languages, but I argue that this root recycling phenomenon also had a role to play. Briefly, I'd like now to introduce how this word formation process comes to take place. That is, how can a root originally meaning something like stand come to mean something like tooth? Or how a root with a meaning like new came to mean white, or a root meaning something like hair coming to mean dog. At the heart of this process lies the extensive system of nominal suffixes available for Southern Cushitic nouns. This chart lists most of the suffixes available in Gorwaa. So the suffix e, or one of the flavors of the suffix e, is used to form the noun luki, a reed mat. And the suffix I is used to form the noun na'i, a child. For our purposes today, what's important is that there are a large number of suffixes in Gorwaa and that they are present on all nouns without exception. So every noun in Gorwaa has to have one of these suffixes. Now, like all languages, Gorwaa possesses a list of roots, so these can be defined as domains of certain specific phonotactic constraints upon which words may be formed. So in this case, the root tsir takes a suffix e, and the resultant meaning tsir'i is bird. The same root, tsir, when taking the suffix o, forms tsir'o, meaning birds. The same process applies for all other roots. So the root au takes the suffix u to form bull, and the suffix a to form bulls. So we have au, which is bull, and awe, which is bulls. Now, the root kaf takes the suffix e to form shell, kafi, and the suffix o to form shells. So we have kafi, a shell, and kafo, shells. Now, crucially, this kind of word formation is not limited to number distinction. So we've had examples where it's singular versus plural. Here, in these examples, the suffixes e and eri turn the root tsifir into language and languages, respectively. But when paired with the suffix ang, the resultant form, sifirang, means a tongue. Now, moving beyond nominal suffixes, this process is also not limited to any particular part of speech. The root da can form the verb to sing, as well as the noun a song. Similarly, the same operation applies to wa to derive the verb vomit and the noun a riverbed. So we have da to sing, and we have da'ang, a song. We have wa to vomit and wa'ang, which is a type of riverbed. Today, we'll be focusing on the kinds of examples on screen, that is, those that result in kind of an appreciable semantic change, one that would make the origin of this sort of word formation process a little bit more difficult to pick up on. So this is, for example, the operation which is formed to vomit and a riverbed from the same root. Now, we can see here that not only is this pattern shared between the South Cushitic languages, in fact, it is reconstructible to a shared predecessor language, West Rift South Cushitic, but furthermore, this pattern of to vomit and a riverbed being formed from the same root is not shared by any of the other Cushitic languages of this sample. So this suggests a lexical innovation that occurred exclusively in Southern Cushitic. A similar pattern can be seen in the nouns tongue and language being formed from the same root. So this is a pattern shared in two South Cushitic languages, Gorwaa and Iraq, but not shared by wider Cushitic. So now that we've provided some precision on the phenomenon of root recycling, I'd like now to address the dimensions of creativity and prolificness. So we'll start by trying to identify how creative root recycling is in Southern Cushitic, using Gorwaa examples to try and locate where root recycling occurred in the development of the language. That is, can the innovation be traced to wider Cushitic, or did it happen in Southern Cushitic, sort of earlier on, or only in Gorwaa? So here we can see a grid, each square representing one Gorwaa word in a Swadesh 200 word list. So supposedly these are words considered basic. And so the highlighted form here represents Swadesh number 35, which is the word for ear. And the highlighted form here represents Swadesh number 133, the word for to see. When we remove pronouns and function words, we can already see that even from this cursory operation, the process gives us a lot of material to start with, actually 13 words, which are probably results of this root recycling word formation process. So when organized into a table, they look like this: 13 concepts from the Swadesh list, represented by 14 words of interest in Gorwaa. Now, each of these 14 words of interest is then compared with 14 other words with which they bear a reasonable resemblance in both meaning and form. When we then take the proposed meaning form pair, we can compare it with similar meaning form pairs from across the rest of the Cushitic family to see if the proposed innovation is shared among Cushitic languages, or whether it's unique to Southern Cushitic or indeed to Gorwaa. As we've seen about our tooth and stand pair, we can see that while the form-meaning pairs match in most of the Southern Cushitic languages, they do not match across wider Cushitic. We can therefore advance the hypothesis that this innovation, most likely the word for tooth being innovated by recycling the root for to stand, happened in southern Cushitic. Other times, the pattern which we see in wider Cushitic suggests that the innovation may not have occurred simply in southern Cushitic, or at least that the innovation is not a rare one. So, for example, if we take the pair wind and blow, we can see that the number of languages or language groups sharing commonalities in the form meaning pairs wind and blow isn't just restricted to southern Cushitic. Adding a new column to report the results of each individual analysis, we can see that 14 of the forms examined, the innovative patterns examined are limited just to South Cushitic. So that's about half of the cases. And all of the highlighted forms have been examined either in the previous talk or early in this one. So I don't really want to focus on these examples. But for the sake of exposition, I would like to very quickly give the data I used for analyzing these new forms, which have yet to be presented. So starting with seed, we can see that Gorwaa has two forms of interest. One is illa, which is equivalent to the form in Gorwaa for the word for eye. And we can see the same pattern in words for eye and seed in Rendile. So we can see that this isn't restricted just to southern Cushitic. We have the same sort of pattern in Rendile. The second pattern for another word for seed is with the verb for to put in. We see the same pattern in the Agao languages, actually. So to put in is something like fuzz, and we get fadana and fazan and bilin and keman. So the pattern is not limited to just southern Cushitic. Rope and braid display a form meaning pattern in southern Cushitic that does not seem to be shared in wider Cushitic. So here is the data. Tail and line are similar with a pattern that obtains in southern Cushitic, but not to wider Cushitic. So we can see that in a number of languages or language groups, they do not share that common pattern between the word for tail and line. Smoke and give off smoke patterns together, both within and beyond southern Cushitic. This is maybe not super surprising, though we can see that actually the data is rather sparse. We actually don't have information for both of these lexemes in many dictionaries that we are working with. But we do get a good pattern in Rendile, so smoke and give off smoke patterns together in this language. Red and burn also pattern together both within and beyond southern Cushitic. So here we can see a shared pattern, as well as perhaps in the Highland East Cushitic language Burji, though as a caveat, I don't know how reliable it is to link one form beginning with a voiced alveolar stop, d, and another with an alveolar ejective t. So I don't know if this is 100% valid, but it looked close enough for me to lump them together. Finally, green and freshness, wetness, or that stomach fluid that's green, chyme, they tend to pattern together both inside and outside of southern Cushitic. So we can see that a number of languages or language groups share commonalities in the form meaning pair here. So this idea of freshness and green, which isn't super surprising. Now, moving from this discussion on creativity, where we tried to identify where in the history many of these innovations took place, I'd like now to think about prolificness. That is, how often does Gorwaa appeal to this root recycling operation in comparison to other languages of the world? So an interesting starting point is with Tadmore et al.'s 2010 concept of analyzability. That is, whether a word is able to be broken down into smaller, meaningful units. So when we're talking about recycling roots in Gorwaa, this is kind of precisely what we're talking about. So in Tadmore et al. 2010, they make use of three levels of analyzability. The first being analyzable. So words can be analyzable. That is, they would apply to an English word like housemate, where we can clearly see that the form is composed of two meaningful morphemes. The multimorphemic status of the word is usually identifiable by speakers of the language themselves. So many speakers of English would look at the word housemate and they would say, yeah, that's formed of house and mate. We can break this word apart. Semi-analyzable words, on the other hand, are those which are made of more than one unit, but where the meaning of all of the constituent units is unclear, or the multimorphemicity of the word is only evident to trained linguists. And a famous example is the word cranberry, right? So the English form cranberry has the morpheme berry in it, and it's a type of berry, but what the heck is a cran? And then words like the English blood, they're unanalyzable either by linguists or speakers of the language, right? We can't really break the word blood down into smaller forms. It's just blood. So yeah, we can see this here. It's just one morpheme. Three words from Gorwaa, which I would classify as similar to these English words, are harmo, which means horn. So our common example, sehino, tooth, and then tluai, which means rain. So now, of course, because of the analysis I put forward in this talk, all of these forms are actually multimorphemic. Yeah. So even a form like charmo, formed of the root charm and the suffix o, could be seen as semi-analyzable. But given, however, that the root charm does not have any forms which I can see as cognate, I will therefore classify it and forms like it as unanalyzable for the purpose of this exercise. So it's a little bit of a sneaky way to modify this, but we'll do it for now. As for the form for tooth, this does have a root with cognates to which I can link the meaning, so I classify it as semi-analyzable here. The root of tluai is easily visible as the verb for to rain, and this is evident to Gorwaa speakers as well. They can see that the word for rain, which is tlu, is very similar to this word tluai. They can see a link here. So in this case, it's one of the rare cases of a fully analyzable form. These three types of form are operationalized in Tadmor et al. 2010 by scoring unanalyzable forms with a value of 1, semi-analyzable forms at 0.75, and analyzable forms as 0.5. So when we repeat this operation with the same words from many languages of the world, as was done in Tadmor et al. 2010, what arises is a score measuring how likely it is in a language of the world for a given form to be formed of multiple morphemes in a language. So the context of this talk, how likely it is to be a recycled root. So I compare each nominal form on their 100-word list, also known as the Leipzig-Jakarta list, with Gorwaa words, and then I did two things. I found the mean of their average value for the 40 typologically and geographically diverse languages of their sample, which was 0.95898, and then I found the mean of the Gorwaa forms, which was 0.92647. So what can be seen is that the Gorwaa value is lower than the worldwide sample from Tadmor et al. 2010. This would suggest that Gorwaa actually makes use of this root recycling strategy rather more frequently than most languages of the world. Now, it may just also mean that Gorwaa is better placed for these kinds of studies because we already have rich resources for the study of its linguistic history represented, for example, in Kiesling and Maus 2008, which is really sort of a treasure trove of forms reconstructed for Proto-West Rift, to which I've deferred many, many times throughout this talk. Should also be said that not all of the recycled root formations in the part of this small study have been analyzed to the extent in the first part of this presentation. So that is, all of the new forms which in this sample would have to be analyzed against data from wider Cushitic to see if the innovation was earlier than Southern Cushitic, as well as the direction that the semantic shift was in. For those of us interested, however, here are some additional pairs which I found during the exercise. So we have de armo, which is the word for root in Gorwaa, or vein, for example, and that's a whole other discussion. But we have a Proto-West Rift possible root for something like to peel or to strip off. Do, we have a form like de, which is like to look at. So this word for house might not seem like it's completely evident, but if we link this to have something to do with cattle herding, this may be associated. Then we have this wonderful connection with the body part form tsiferang, which probably comes from tsufirang. And then we look at this verb form for to sweat. So the tongue is the little sweaty thing in your head, right? I think this is wonderful. Again, we have the word for rain. This is not super surprising. So we have uai and ub. We have hantimo, which is the shade and shadow. Then we have the form for ham, to get lost. This may be a possible connection. And then we have the word for ni, which is gurungura. But if we look at the word gurung, this is the sound of something moving as for a hinge. So in this case, the word is linked not necessarily to a verb or to another noun, but is linked to an idiophone. So this is, I think, wonderful, and sort of the kudos are due to Kiesling and Maus 2008 for sort of identifying these similarities. So, prospects and conclusions. Returning to our first question about creativity in root recycling, of the 14 concepts on the Swadesh 200 list, which could be identified as results of root recycling operations, 7 could be identified as innovating at the level of Southern Cushitic, and 7 were found to share similar patterns among the languages of the sample among wider Cushitic. Note, however, that these innovations in the sample for wider Cushitic rarely involved forms that could be identified as cognates with the forms that underwent the same innovation in Southern Cushitic. Regarding the second question, when measured against a sample of 41 typologically diverse languages from different parts of the world, Gorwaa roots were significantly more likely to have been recycled. This may be a reflection of the fact that there is better material for conducting etymological work with Gorwaa and Southern Cushitic than the languages of the overall sample, and that's a real advantage for us. But it may also mean that Gorwaa and the Southern Cushitic languages have genuinely appealed to this operation more extensively than other languages have. What does this mean? Well, it means that at some point or across some period of time in the predecessor languages of the Southern Cushitic language, like Proto-West Rift, they began replacing existing words in their lexicon. I'm thinking especially of words for concepts such as tongue, tooth, and white, by metaphoric associations with the characteristics of other words. So they essentially decided to use metaphor as a tool for deriving new words. They also use this process to name new items and concepts, perhaps the idea of a braided rope as being a new form of technology, or the color green as being a new lexical coining. This has resulted in a Southern Cushitic lexicon whose contents are markedly different from languages from wider Cushitic more generally. So what are our next steps? I think that they're all very fun. They involve taking this concept and expanding it beyond what has already been identified in the treatments of wordless length scope, which I've done so far, to the wider lexicon of Gorwaa. So candidates for being results of this kind of shift should then be compared across the wider Southern Cushitic languages, Alagwa, Burunge, and Iraq. Additionally, identifying how commonly such operations were carried out across different semantic fields, so household items versus wild animals, for example, may tell us something about the social and historical dynamic which led to this process taking place. So before finishing, I'd like to thank Martin Maus for encouraging me to pick up this topic once again and bring it a few steps forward. So thank you, Martin, for that. I'd also like to thank the Gorwaa local researchers, Pascal Buu, Stefano Edward, Christina Guai, and Festo Massani, for bringing more and more Gorwaa lexical items to light. And of course, thanks are also due to all of the Gorwaa people who participated in the research over the years. Na'ase wa'alo. And here are my figures. And here are my references. And yes, so Bonnie has a riddle here, which you know is terrible bait for me, Bonnie, because I'm always going to wonder what the riddle is. So we have. Do you want to read it out for us?
Sure. Well, 30 white horses on a red hill. First they champ, then they stamp, then they stand still. I think it's just an old English one, but when you said that the teeth were the standers, this was what came to mind. Because I normally don't think of teeth as just things that stand, but then I'm like, whoa, that reminds me of this riddle. And then that made me wonder, geez, maybe some of these concepts come from riddles. And of course, once you change the word for teeth to the standers, then maybe that riddle doesn't work anymore. So maybe you won't find these riddles anymore in South Cushitic. But
What's amazing to me is that so the average speaker of Gorwaa wouldn't notice this now. They don't associate teeth and standing. But I think what's incredible is that at some point a speaker did. And they did this and they made it a thing and it caught on in the rest of the language. So does this mean that there was a point in Proto-West Rift or whatever where people did talk about the standards in their mouth? And then eventually, they just sort of lost that association. I love to think about this, or like the tongue as being like the sweaty guy in your mouth, right? I just love this and the fact that it was done again and again across the language. Christian notes seed and I are co-lexified also in bench. And I mean, to some extent, like it's not super surprising, right? Like a little glittery thing, it shines in a way, dark, So sure, why not? Bonnie,
I think
you're
that is a very common one
yeah,
more
also
generally as
just
well.
as a round thing, a small round thing. So pretty much all of the colexifications, if you will, that occur in other parts of Cushitic are cross-linguistically common. I would say, wind and blow, or I, see and I. But the ones that are the most interesting to me are these ones that seem like the tongue and sweat, house and look at, vomit and riverbed, and tail and line that I've never heard of anywhere else. But as far as vomit and riverbed, riverbed and throat are colexified in a lot of Kwe languages. So I'm wondering if there might be a throat connection either in your vomit word or in your riverbed word, and if you would gullet, throat, that sort of thing,
uh
connecting to.
I think that for throat and gullet we often get a form like heha. But of course we could look wider. I mean, the only form that I get is wa, which would be to vomit, this verb. Um
That sounds onomatopoeic, kind
yeah,
of.
yeah, of course. Yeah, right? Like it strikes me as an onomatopoeia.
But still,
Different
the
kind of suffix
product
like
of the throat is vomit, so there's a connection there
Yeah,
still.
could very
yeah.
well be. Stephen.
So yeah, I was gonna say you have like a lot of different shaped suffixes, right, in these derivations. Um, and so, to what extent is it clear? What kind of derivations are they? Like, are they the thing that is, are they the result of the act? Are they kind of a tool? Are they a place? Because like I was thinking, like a riverbed, like if the rivers run dry and then it rains, and then the riverbed fills back up, it could be like the place where like the water vomits down the river channel or something like that, right?
Certainly, and
Um,
I think that if we're really perspicacy here, we could probably break that ong suffix down into an M and a U, and that would then make it like wa'am, which is like throwing up, and then a U. So the thing that habitually throws up. So
okay,
that would
right, yeah.
be that would be sort of, yeah. And the same thing with the tsiferang, this ang, it would be something like tsufum maybe, which is like to habitually sweat. So the thing that habitually sweats, I think that you could do. So I mean, Roland Kiesling has done some great reconstructive work to figure out what some of these suffixes may mean. I haven't done too much work on the semantics of this sort of currently. I don't know if this is something that still applies or whether these suffixes have mainly lost their semantic force. But to an extent, I mean, we do need to look at it because it seems like when we locate much of this innovation, it actually did occur in Proto-West Rift, which was when Roland was looking at sort of the semantic meanings behind these endings. So yeah, it's worth looking at this and to see sort of what we get.
And then if I can, I have
Yeah, sure.
another couple of questions at least. So yeah, so obviously, like Bonnie brought up the idea of riddles being potential source for this, right? But I was also wondering whether is the a practical like avoidance reason why you might want to innovate and re-innovate um, material like this, right? Like a mother-in-law avoidance and that kind of thing. Like,
So I get a sense that it doesn't have anything to do with mother-in-law avoidance because none of the forms that I have so far, I think, are also Gorwaa personal names. You can have
uh huh,
common nouns that are personal names in Gorwaa, but None of these ones that I think have a history of being, of being products of root recycling are personal names, at least now in Gorwaa. Now, of course, the all bets are off for guessing what personal names were in the past in Proto-West Rift. So, I mean, that could very well be a case. Certainly, well, actually, the word for rain, for example, I mean, that's a very common name, and we know in other languages that that's the case as well. So, heck, maybe. But a lot of them are body parts, which could have kind of a taboo function. We don't want to use that direct word, but they're not incredibly rude body parts, except for the word for buttocks is what is it? Guedo or guedo, which is the opening things. Actually, a euphemism for another word that they use.
I've had emails thrown into spam because of using the word tongue. Just
Oh my.
FYI.
And I think it's an interesting question. I mean, Bonnie, this idea about riddles and, were riddles possibly an engine for this? We know, of course, that riddles and riddling it's an incredibly rich and well-established thing in these languages and in the wider area. So, I mean, why not? Certainly, there are riddles about the tongue. There are riddles about other body parts. So,
With saliva having such a special functions in Cushitic culture too, I can see why they might be referring to sweat rather than saliva for
well,
the tongue.
and there are specific riddles about the blacksmith working in the shade, and the answer being the tongue. And of course, it's, if you're a blacksmith, you're going to be sweating. So there are these interesting semantic parallels, Bonnie, and that's really cool. So bringing sort of different strands of research, different strands into this. I think this is just my guess because I haven't done the work, but I think that the most frequent cases of this recycling are going to be in body parts and wild animal terms. This seems to be where you get the most common uh, forms, which is kind of neat because in one case this is vocabulary that's already there. This is clearly replacive. And then for the wild animals, well, you'd need to do a bit of research, but it could actually be like coining new words for new things that we're encountering. You know?
I think you should consider children's language play as potentially going on here. I mean, then we would expect perhaps a lot of terms for insects to have special characteristics like this, although those often have onomatopoeia or
Yeah,
reduplication
yeah.
going on.
Martin.
Yeah, on this line, I was also thinking on what kind of circumstances would you get this creativity? And one thing I thought of is that you have this high proportion of second language speakers in a language when you don't want to bring your words from the old language. You want to speak the new language, but you're creative and for Iraqi, we know that the vast majority were second language speakers. For the other languages, that doesn't work. But that was just something that came to mind.
Yeah, yeah, this could certainly be a part of the dynamic, Martin.
And very interesting. Yes, you have to publish this, and then be careful with your links. So I find most of them convincing, but the line and the tail, what would that S be? So you have to be restrictive in that the additional elements are really established as morphemes.
Well, I mean, is it a thing that goes in a line? And then, of course, you could link it
The
to
causative.
example for the word for, yeah, you could link it, of course, it's the hayuso. You could also link it, for example, to the word for journey, hayut. So it's to actually draw a line, right? When you're traveling.
Hayut, yes.
Yeah.
The oot, but the oot is yeah.
Is a stative, yeah, or something. Yeah.
The oot I take, but yeah. So yeah, when you publish it, be restrictive at that side. That there's no doubt about the derivational aspect.
we have some more discussions to have about this. But I've probably been going on too long now, and we need to hand it to Daniel, our anchor leg, so he can give the final presentation.